Alright, another question I have been posed many times is, in historical manuscripts and artworks, knights are depicted with a straight leg slightly forward of their body. Should we strive to copy that, or should we use something closer to a modern dressage alignment with the ears, shoulders, hips and heels? Now this is an interesting question, and one that I get quite a lot, because I tend to teach a seat very similar to a modern dressage seat that's balanced over the horse with leg contact, with lots of use of the seat as an aid and legs as the aid. The seat that you see in the manuscripts with the legs forward is a style of riding. It's a medieval style of riding, but it's not the only way to ride in a medieval context. King Duarte, in his late 14th and early 15th century treatise on horsemanship, actually clearly describes, I think, 5 different ways of riding relative to different saddle types and different regions of riding. Riding with the legs forward in that deep seat like that is one way that he describes. If I'm not mistaken, I believe he describes that as a bride, riding a la bride, which translates to actually riding on the bridle, which I believe is riding with the bridle in a reining kind of way, where the legs are in front of you and not as active on the side, using them to control the horse as much as using the bridle. What I like to use myself, and what I teach my students, is something closer to a gineta seat, which is very similar to what's used by the modern bullfighters, but it's a very classical and very old way of riding, where the seat and legs are the main aids used for steering and controlling the horse. The reins, once training has been achieved, the reins become quite passive. They're not loose, there's still contact in the reins, but you don't have to use your rein hand a lot to be able to control your horse and steer your horse, which allows for a very steady and stable seat, very steady and stable and strong platform to be able to fight your opponents with. Another question: would I like to see more emphasis on the melee instead of the joust? That's a very good question. I very much enjoy the melee, particularly when it's done well, with well-schooled horses and well-schooled competitors. I think melees work best the way that they were run historically, as team tournaments or team competitions, with one team facing off against the other. I've always found one-on-one melees to be relatively scrappy and a little less controlled. Team melees open up a whole lot of opportunities for strategic advantages and maneuvering advantages that you can't do when it's one-on-one. Do I want to see more of them than jousts? I'm not sure. There's something in a joust which I find very challenging, mentally and physically. It's challenging for me and my horse, but in a different way to the melee. I like doing both, probably as much as the other. So yes, for the tournaments that don't have melees, I wouldn't mind seeing a few more. They don't have to be at every tournament. I do quite like jousting by itself, but I wouldn't like to see melees be the one thing that take over, because I really love jousting and I love the challenge of jousting. Another question: do I think shaped historical solid lances are the wave of the future? I think they're perhaps a wave of the future. I don't think there's ever going to be one way of jousting which is the way of jousting. There's always going to be different styles, just like historically there were different styles of lances used in different regions, different styles of armor used in different regions, and even sometimes, you know, into the early 16th century and on, we start to see different styles of lances and armor used in the same region for different events. So I don't think it's the wave of the future, but it's definitely a wave of the future. Us that have tried it, you know, the solid lances with steel coronels and the grappers, very much enjoyed it. Liked the type of hit and liked the style of jousting, and we're definitely planning on doing more. Next question: if cost wasn't a factor, would you use solid or replaceable tipped lances primarily? It's a pretty good question. The cost often isn't really the factor involved in whether to use solid lances or frangible tipped lances. A lot of the time it's who will you be jousting against, what's their quality of jousting ability. What are the horses like? What's the tilt and the lists going to be? The size, the length. All of these things do come into play when deciding whether to use solid lances or balsa lances. Well, for me at least. I much prefer to have a long historical length tilt or list when using a solid lance, because it's that much more dangerous, that it's really important that you have the time that's required to do a correct levee, bring the lance onto target, onto your arete, bring the grapper against your arete, and be able to hit true and safe. It's more important with the solids than it is with the balsa. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it correctly with balsa lances or any other frangible tip lance, but it's just not as important if you get it wrong.
I should probably get out of my armor at some point.
So, also to answer that question, while the clanky nights go by, I wouldn't want to do too many solid lance jousts a year on my horse. They do take a slightly heavier toll on the horse, being as the hits are consistently heavier. But, you know, and it takes a lot more time out of training to train up for it, to train the horse for it, to train me for it. So I would be happy to do 4 to 6 top level, high-end solid lance jousts a year, and that would probably be it. But we will mix in the future. We mix balsa jousts or frangible tip jousts in between as well. It's really good training for the horses. It's a little bit easier on the horses in training. So I don't think I'll be doing one way and not the other. I'll definitely be doing both styles in the future. What do we got here? Another question. How useful do I think Duarte really is? That's a good question. I actually really, and have ever since the first time I read him, and I like to read it regularly, I actually do think that the current translation and the book that Duarte wrote is a very useful tool and a very good insight into medieval horsemanship. Some of the things are difficult for us to understand because we don't know the context in which it was written or on what he is talking about exactly. Sometimes he talks about specific elements that we don't use or don't have anymore, so it makes it a little bit difficult in that way. But I think the general premise on what he talks about, the styles of riding, are quite understandable and quite useful for us to interpret and to recreate historical, accurate riding techniques. Some of the translation may be a little bit off. I've heard many people say, but I can't tell myself, having never learnt medieval Portuguese. From what I understand, there is another translation underway, but I have a Portuguese trainer that I use, and we've spoken about quite a few of the things, and some of it is still used in Portugal still. So maybe it's just a cultural misunderstanding more than a translation misunderstanding. But I think Duarte is a very good read and well worth checking out if you haven't read it yet.